All right, today we're jumping into a document that tackles a huge, and honestly, a really contentious question in faith. Where does true religious authority actually come from? It's a question that has literally shaped empires and lives, and this particular treatise offers a very specific path to an answer.
So this is the big one, right? This is a central question the entire document is trying to answer. And the way it goes about it is pretty interesting. It's essentially a head-to-head comparison. It takes four major religious traditions and pits their claims against each other to see which one, in its view, really holds up under scrutiny.
Okay, so let's get into it. The analysis kicks off by laying out the foundational claim of each of these traditions. What's their starting point? Let's see how the document frames them.
So, what we're looking at here is how the document defines each tradition's claim to fame, you could say. For Catholicism, it's all about that unbroken line of priesthood, stretching all the way back to the apostles. For Protestantism, the bedrock is sola scriptura. Scripture alone is the final word. Judaism, on the other hand, relies on the powerful combination of the written Torah and the oral law passed down through generations. And finally, you have the Restoration movement, which claims its authority is brand new, coming from a direct divine intervention in modern times. So right off the bat, you can see these are fundamentally different starting points. And that's really the whole setup for the rest of the analysis.
So, with these four very different claims on the table, how does the source even begin to compare them? Well, it sets up a kind of historical stress test. It decides to compare each one against a specific model of first-century Christianity that it builds using scripture and historical accounts. The document basically pulls out these specific traits that it says define the original early church, things like having apostolic leadership, believing in living prophets, and ongoing revelation, specific practices like baptism by immersion, and even how they viewed Scripture as an open rather than a closed book. And once it has this checklist, it grades each tradition against it. So let's take a look at how they scored. And wow, when you see the scores the source gives out, they are not close. According to its own metric, the Restoration movement scores a 45 out of a possible 50. Catholicism gets a 25, Protestantism a 15, and Judaism a 5. And this next visual really drives home just how big that gap is.
This chart really makes it clear, doesn't it? Based on this analysis, the document makes its call. The Restoration aligns most closely with its first-century benchmark. And with that point made, the focus of the document shifts from the movement as a whole to the man who started it. So now the analysis zooms in on Joseph Smith. The source calls him the conduit for this restoration and argues that his background isn't just a biographical detail, it's actually a key part of the whole story.
The source really leans into this classic biblical idea, this pattern of the humble person being chosen to do extraordinary things. It frames Joseph Smith as an uneducated farm boy and argues that this very background is what makes his alleged achievements, like producing a massive, complex book of scripture, so astonishing and, in the source's view, points to divine help.
So the document lays out these key achievements: translating scripture, organizing a worldwide church, revealing intricate doctrines, and setting up temples. The idea here is to build a case that this is all just highly improbable for one person from his background. And that improbability, the source suggests, is exactly why there are so many critics. So what's the next logical step? Well, you have to answer them.
And that's what the document does next. It systematically lays out what it sees as the most common critical theories about Joseph Smith's work and then tries to rebut them, one by one.
First up, the plagiarism theory. The document's counterargument is basically, sure, you can find similar themes floating around at the time, but show me the book that puts it all together like this. It argues that a single source text that could account for the narrative and doctrinal complexity of the Book of Mormon, well, it just doesn't exist.
Then there's the idea that it was all a fraud, for money or for fame. And the rebuttal here is pretty direct. It points to the intense persecution, the jail time, and ultimately the martyrdom of the early leaders, and it asks, does that really sound like the behavior of a con man just looking out for himself?
And finally, you've got this other theory. Maybe Joseph Smith wasn't a con man, but some kind of unwitting, subconscious genius who created it all himself. The source pushes back hard on this one. It claims that this idea just doesn't hold water when you consider the doctrinal consistency of a huge book that was dictated orally. It's basically saying that would require a level of spontaneous literary genius that's, well, almost unheard of in history. Okay, so after tackling those criticisms head-on, the source is ready to deliver its final verdict. It presents one last scorecard, this time based on what it defines as the key signs of legitimate authority from God.
And it all comes down to this, the final scorecard.
Using its own hand-picked criteria, things like a belief in ongoing modern revelation, a claim to restored priesthood power, and what it calls doctrinal purity, the document awards a perfect 50 out of 50 to the Restoration movement.
And that's the number the whole analysis has been building towards. 50 out of 50. According to this document, it's a perfect match. The author concludes by stating that this perfect score is supported by what it calls, and I'm quoting here, overwhelming evidence.
So the document definitely makes its case, and it doesn't pull any punches in getting to its conclusion. But walking through this whole process brings up a much bigger question for us to think about, doesn't it? What is it that truly makes an argument like this persuasive? Is it the evidence, the logic, the scorecards like we've just seen? Or, at the end of the day, does it all come down to a matter of personal conviction, something that can't really be measured on a chart, something to chew on? Thanks for joining me for this breakdown.